with our tweeting. Now, I know, right? So I have like 4 Twitter friends, whatever, so I don't know what this actually means, but keep up the good work. If you keep tweeting, we may trend again yet this afternoon or tomorrow, so good job, keep it up. I want to take just a minute to introduce our plenary speaker for our luncheon plenary session. We're really pleased and lucky to have Professor Sean Reardon join us today. He is the endowed professor of poverty and inequality in education at Stanford University. So not only are we lucky to have him, but he may get the award for the farthest travel. I'm not sure yet. His research focuses on the causes, patterns, trends, and consequences of social and educational inequality, the effects of educational policy on educational and social inequality, and in applied statistical methods for educational research. He also develops methods of measuring social and educational inequality and methods of causal inference in educational and social science research. So he's here today to talk to you about his work. We'd like you to think about how it applies to your work and those connections between the early years and the later educational aspirations for children. We're happy to have him, and we would like you to welcome Professor Sean Reardon.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to talk to you today. I'm going to confess at the beginning that my primary area of expertise is not early childhood or home visiting. My area of expertise is really educational opportunity and inequality in educational opportunity. And a lot of the work I've done over the last decade or so has increasingly pointed to the importance of early childhood in shaping educational opportunity. And I want to sort of talk to you about some of that work that I've done and work that others have done about what we know about opportunity in early childhood. So I'm going to start with this figure, and I'll come back to this later, but this is a picture that shows the trend in the achievement gap between high and low income students, that's the white line, over the last 50 or 60 years. So the horizontal axis here is time, birth years, and the vertical axis is a measure of the size of the achievement gap in elementary and middle and high school between high income and low income students. And the main story here is that achievement gap has been relatively large. That's about a 2 grade level difference in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then started to grow a lot in the 1970s through 2000, when it was more than 3.5 grade levels. And then there's a little bit of a decline there at the end, and so I want to come back to this later on and talk about what's led to the growth in this achievement gap between high and low income students and what's led to this more recent decline. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about educational opportunity more broadly. So one of the projects that I've been working on with a group of collaborators is this project to measure educational opportunity everywhere in the United States at a fine level of detail. And so what we've done is we've taken 300 million standardized test scores, the test scores of every public school student in the United States over the last 7 years, in every school and school district in the country, and put them on a common scale and use them as measures of the extent of educational opportunity in every community in the country. So this is a map that you can think of as a map of educational opportunity. It's a map of test scores. The purple are places where test scores are well below the national average. The dark green are places where test scores are well above the national average. And you can see there's an enormous amount of variation in test scores across the country. And I'm going to talk a lot about test scores today, so let me just say a few things about test scores. So I think you should think of standardized test scores that children take in school, not as solely the result of things that happen in schools. Instead, think of them as measures of the sum total of educational opportunities that children have had from birth or even prenatally all the way through the time that they take the test in middle school or high school. That is, experiences they have in the home, in their childcare or preschool centers, in their neighborhoods, in their after-school programs, as well as in their schools. And so I think of the test scores more as a measure of opportunity than a measure of school quality or anything like that. Secondly, it's important to think of test scores not as measures of intelligence, but measures of performance. That is, they're shaped by the opportunities kids have to learn, what they're taught, as well as their motivation to perform. And particularly when we're measuring them at the aggregate level, so when we're taking average test scores of children within a community, they're much more reflective of opportunity differences between communities, because average intelligence or innate capabilities don't differ systematically between population groups or between places. So any differences in average test scores have to be about differences in the kinds of opportunities that children have who grow up in one place or another place. And finally, don't think of test scores as the only developmental or educational outcome we care about. Obviously, we care about children being happy and creative and collaborative and empathetic and all sorts of things besides good at math and reading skills. But they're still, I think, useful as an indicator of educational opportunity because they do tell us something about the set of educational opportunities that children have had, even if they're not the sum total of everything we care about. So with that as kind of caveat or framing for how we should think about these test scores, let me say a little bit more about how opportunity varies across the United States. So this is a scatter plot of the 12,000 school districts in the United States. Each circle there is a single school district in the United States. And on the horizontal axis, we have a measure of the socioeconomic conditions in a community. So this is kind of a composite measure of the median income in a community, the percentage of families where parents have a bachelor's degree or more, the poverty rate, the unemployment rate, the SNAP eligibility rate, and the percentage of families headed by single mothers. And so on the left end there are places that are sort of low on all of those dimensions: high poverty, low educational levels, high unemployment, high SNAP eligibility, and so on. And the right-hand side are the more affluent, advantaged places. The vertical axis here is this measure of average test scores or average opportunity, where 0 represents kind of the national average. And we measure it in grade level equivalence. So you can see that the most affluent places in the United States, children score on average 2 or more grade levels above the national average and 4 or more grade levels above places in the most disadvantaged places. So there's an enormous difference, even by middle school, in the kinds of educational, or actually this is by 3rd grade, in the kinds of opportunities that children have had. So there's great differences in opportunity, and they arise relatively early, that is, before 3rd grade. The correlation there, for those of you who like correlations, is about 0.75. So knowing something about socioeconomic conditions in a community tells us an awful lot about the extent of opportunity for children growing up in those communities. Now, even so, there's still lots of variation across place. So if we just look at the 100 largest school districts in the United States, that's these yellow dots, there's still a lot of variation. So the large dot there in the middle is New York City. The one sort of below and to the right that's also large is Los Angeles, and Chicago's a little below and to the left. So Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York are all relatively similar in terms of the socioeconomic backgrounds of children and socioeconomic conditions in which they grow up in. And yet there's more than a grade level of difference in average performance, that is, more than a grade level difference in opportunity for children who grow up in those communities. And so that says, even though opportunity is structured by socioeconomic conditions, it's not determined by it. That there are places that are quite similar socioeconomically, but still differ in the kinds of opportunities that children have. And so one of the things my team and I are working on is trying to figure out what is it about different places that leads to higher opportunities before 3rd grade in New York than before 3rd grade in Los Angeles or Chicago. Now, one of the things we do is, since we have test scores between 3rd and 8th grade for each place, we can look not just at the average level of test scores in a place, but we can look at how much they change from 3rd to 8th grade. And so we can characterize each community in the United States along two dimensions that I think of as sort of early opportunities and growth opportunities. And we measure the early opportunities by how well are children performing in third grade. What kinds of opportunities have they had prior to third grade? We measure the growth opportunities by how fast do test scores improve from third to eighth grade. Now you might think those growth opportunities are probably much more influenced by schooling, whereas the early opportunities are going to be influenced by some combination of schooling from K to 3, as well as all the experiences and opportunities children have before they even enter kindergarten. So if we separate the test scores in each place into these two dimensions, early opportunity and growth opportunity, you can think of any school district in the country as falling in one of these four quadrants. So the lower left are places where test scores are low in third grade and grow at a slow rate from third to eighth grade. So they're low on early opportunity and low on growth opportunity. Upper right would be high on growth and high on early opportunity and so on. And so what we were interested in is, well, where are the places that are in these four quadrants, or are the places that are early, that have high early opportunity, also the places that have high growth opportunity and vice versa? And what we found is this: there's no correlation at all between the extent of early opportunities in a community and the growth opportunities. So the things that contribute to children's opportunities prior to third grade are uncorrelated across the United States with the things that provide opportunities from third to eighth grade. So if you think of third to eighth grade growth as much closer to a measure of school quality, then the places sort of on the top half of this graph are the places with, you know, sort of higher growth and higher quality. But if you think of the third grade scores as a measure of early opportunities, early childhood opportunities, as well as K through 3, that's the left-right axis. There are places in any quadrant you want. If we look at those 100 large districts again, they are also fall in all the quadrants. So this one on the upper left here is interesting. So that's Chicago. You might have seen the story in the New York Times in December about Chicago. So Chicago students enter third grade with average test scores about a grade and a half below the national average. So quite low on early opportunity. That's why it's to the left here on the picture. But test scores in Chicago grow at a rate 20% faster than the national average. And that's true for black students, Hispanic students, and white students in Chicago. It's true for poor students and non-poor students in Chicago. That is, test scores growth, the growth opportunities in Chicago, are very high. They're higher than any of the other 100 large districts in the United States and at the 96th percentile of all districts in the United States. So Chicago is this interesting place where early opportunity is not good, but something good is happening in the elementary and middle school years. There's other places on the sort of lower right quadrant where the opposite is true. Kids come in with doing quite well, with good opportunities early on, but then the schools aren't sort of sustaining that. So one of the things we've been trying to think about and understand is what are the characteristics of those places? But one thing we've done then is say, well, what does opportunity look like, not just for the average student, but what does it look like for poor students in particular? And so if we just look at the test scores of low-income students in every district in the country, this is what we see. So in almost every district in the country, the poor students fall on the I've forgotten my sides, the left side of that graph. That is to say, early opportunities are lower than average for poor students. But many of them have higher than average growth opportunities. So where we're letting our poor students down is not in grades 3 to 8. It's in those early years, up before grade 3. Early childhood and the early elementary school years. If you look at non-poor students, it's exactly the opposite. They look great on early opportunity, and mixed on growth opportunities. Some places doing well, some places not doing so well. So one other way to look at this same thing is the same data but showed a slightly different way. So on the horizontal axis is the average test scores in a district of non-poor students in third grade. And on the vertical axis is the average performance in third grade of poor students in the same district. And that diagonal line there is the 45-degree line. If poor and non-poor students had the same test scores in third grade, same opportunities prior to third grade, they'd fall right on that diagonal line. Well, you can see almost nobody falls on or even near the diagonal line in most school districts in the country. And when I say most, I mean about 11,250 out of 11,256 school districts in the country or something. Poor students get to third grade with lower average academic skills than non-poor students. That is, they've had fewer opportunities, and those opportunities put them on average about 2 grade levels behind in third grade. That's true for big districts, it's true for small districts, it's true all over the country. Suburban, urban, rural, any kind of district you like. But if you look at how much their test scores improve from 3rd to 8th grade, so now this is the same picture except we're looking at these growth rates from 3rd to 8th grade for non-poor students and poor students, they're much closer to the 45-degree line. On average, they're about 5% below the 45-degree line, so growth rates are slightly below, lower for poor students than non-poor students, but not dramatically different. And in many places, like Chicago down here on the left, growth rates are actually higher for poor students than for non-poor students in the district. So that is to say, the real problem, the real place where society, where we're failing our poor students, is not in their elementary and middle school years as much as it is in their early childhood opportunities. And by early childhood, I'm kind of including preschool up to 3rd grade because we don't have test score data before 3rd grade. Now, we do have one national study, the early childhood longitudinal study. This is a cohort of children in fall of 1998 who were in kindergarten, 25,000 children in kindergarten in 1998 who were then followed all the way through 8th grade. A study done by the National Center for Education Statistics. And those children were assessed, one-on-one assessments, in fall of kindergarten, spring of kindergarten, fall and spring of 1st grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, and 8th grade. So we can sort of track their academic development all the way from kindergarten through 8th grade. And actually in another study, we can track kids from age 4 into kindergarten. And so by looking at those, we can get a sense of how achievement gaps and academic growth differs for poor and non-poor students. And what we see, the vertical axis here is a measure of the achievement gap between poor and non-poor students, here measured in standard deviation units. And you can see that in the fall of kindergarten, it's about a little more than 1 standard deviation unit, which is sort of more than a grade level in kindergarten. They're more than a year behind, basically. And it doesn't change a whole lot by 8th grade. That is to say, the gaps in opportunity are really there before kindergarten. And when we look at the age 4 data, actually the gaps are just as large at age 4 as they are in kindergarten. So that tells us that the real action in terms of where the opportunity differences really lie for poor and non-poor students in American society are early in kids' lives, before age 4. It's not to say that schools can't do anything about it. I work with a lot of people who care a lot about K-12 schools, and as you saw in those other figures, there's lots of places, poor places where growth rates are high, and those places are sort of narrowing the gap and doing a good job, and we need to learn from them. So it's not that we should write kids off after age 4 or something, right? But it's a lot easier to address this problem if we keep it from getting large rather than try to remedy it after it's already gotten large. So for all those reasons, it says the real action in trying to think about how we create more opportunity for low-income students has to happen early in their lives. I probably don't need to convince you guys of that. Some other audience I have to persuade, but not you guys. So let's go back to this picture. So this is this picture, and I want you to focus on the white line here, this achievement gap between high and low-income students. So why did this gap widen starting in the 70s, and why did it narrow? We know that lots of the reason it widened and narrowed is because of kids' performance early on. That is, it didn't widen and narrow because schools got sort of more unequal and then got more equal. That is, most of this is driven by changes in school readiness over time. But why did that happen? Well, first, let me clarify a few things. The gap widens not because poor children are doing worse over time. Actually, if you look at test scores going back to the 1970s in the United States using the NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress, test scores have been going up nationally for 4th and 8th graders for decades. And so if we put them on a scale that's kind of like an SAT scale just for interpretability, the 3 lines here represent average test scores of children at the 90th percentile of the income distribution, the 50th, and the 10th. So rich students, middle class, and poor students. And test scores have gone up over the last few decades for poor students as well as for rich students. They've just gone up faster for rich students. And so the gap has been widened over that period from the mid-70s to 2000, not because poor children were sort of doing worse. In fact, everyone was doing better, but rich children were doing a lot better. That's also true if we look at the racial achievement gaps. So the Black and Hispanic lines are the bottom 2 and the white ones there. And you can see Black and Hispanic students in the late 1970s had test scores just dramatically below white students. But the test scores of Black and Hispanic students now are almost equal to what white students' test scores were in the late 1970s. That is, they've caught up almost the equivalent of 100 points on an SAT test or a standard deviation. That's a year's worth of learning or more. But white students' test scores have also gone up, but not as fast. So the gaps are widening in the case of income or narrowing in the case of racial achievement gaps because everyone's test scores are going up, but they're going up at different rates. Same thing is true, this is age 13, same thing is true at age 9 when we look at the younger data. So the gaps are changing more because what's happening early on and more because of differences in how fast everyone's growing, not because of declines in some groups. So what happened over this time period? Well, one of the big things that happened starting in the late 1970s was that income inequality in the United States started to grow. So this is a picture of one measure of income inequality, the proportion of all income earned in the United States that was earned by the top 10% of earners. If everyone got the same amount, this number would be 10%. So in the early part of the century, in the 1920s, 1930s, the share of income going to the top 10% was about 45%, so almost half of all income went to the top 10%. That dropped to about a third with World War II. The economy was restructured, wage controls were put in place, and the economy changed in some dramatic ways, and income inequality was historically low from World War II all the way into the 1970s. In the 1970s, the economy starts to change for a whole bunch of reasons that an economist could tell you about, but I won't. But income inequality started to rise and has continued to rise despite a few little blips here and there, and now is higher than it has been at any time in the last 100 years. So the top 10% of earners in the United States now make about 49% of all income in the United States. Most of that increase is because of the top 1% earning more. So income inequality rose. Well, what does that mean? That means high income and low income families have much larger differences in income, and that might mean they can do different things for their children. One thing they do differently is they increasingly live in different neighborhoods. So this is a slide based on some work I did with my colleague Kendra Bischoff, and we were looking at segregation by income in the United States over the last 40 years. So if you characterize communities as affluent or middle class or poor based on their median income, the proportion of families who live in either very affluent or very poor communities has more than doubled over the last 40 or 50 years. So in 1970, only about 16% of families either lived in very affluent or very poor neighborhoods, and 2/3 of families lived in sort of mixed income, middle income kinds of neighborhoods. Now, only about 40% of families live in those mixed income neighborhoods, and over 1/3 of families live in either very affluent or very poor neighborhoods. So we're much more segregated by income than we used to be. This segregation by income is particularly pronounced for families with children. So households without children are not really much more segregated than they used to be, but households with children are the ones driving this trend. So kids are growing up in increasingly segregated communities. If not only are their parents rich or poor, but their communities are increasingly likely to be rich or poor. And so all the resources that come with a rich or poor community, that sort of compounds the effect of family income. Families are also spending different amounts of money on their children. So if you look at consumer expenditure survey data, which goes back to the 1970s. And you look at the expenditures, what are people spending on what can be classified as enrichment expenditures for the children. So this would be things like books and games for the kids. It'd be things like tutoring, things like camps, anything that might be sort of thought of as a kind of developmentally enriching experience. Well, high-income families have always spent more than low-income families on their children. That's not surprising. They have more to spend. And everyone spends more now than they used to. So even families in the bottom income quintile now spend 57% more on their children in real dollars than they spent in the early 1970s. So everyone's investing more in their kids, and this is despite the fact that real incomes haven't gone up much for folks at the bottom, right? So they're spending more of what little they have on their children. But high-income families are spending 150% more than they used to. So they've more than doubled their investments in their kids over the same time period. So the disparity in investments in enrichment activities between low and high income kids has widened dramatically, as you can see there. And so that's part of the reason why we think there's this widening disparity in kids' academic performance, because they've had different opportunities related to these different kinds of investments. Now, why are they investing differently in their kids? So there's this fascinating study by Julia Wrigley. So Julia Wrigley is a social historian, and she looked at, and her graduate students, to be honest, probably were the ones who really did this, looked at like 1,000 magazine articles from all across the 20th century up to the mid-'80s when she did the study. And they looked at magazines that were aimed at mothers, like Ladies' Home Journal or Mother magazine, or I don't know. You could tell how often I read those magazines. But magazines that were sort of intended to be read by mothers of young children, and she looked in particular at articles that gave expert advice to new moms, like articles that were basically like, so you've got this new baby, what should you do with it? Kind of what a home visiting person might do, right? So at the beginning of the 20th century, most of the advice was about physical well-being of the baby, nutrition and medical advice, what to feed your baby, and how to keep her alive. Infant mortality was non-trivial at the turn of the century in the United States. It's still higher than most developed countries in the US, but lower than it was. But keeping your baby alive was actually sort of first-order business. And so this wasn't unreasonable advice. But the advice also was notable for not saying anything much about intellectual stimulation or social-emotional development. And in fact, she gives examples of some of the advice that was basically opposed to intellectual stimulation. Basically, your child is a vegetable and should sleep about 20 to 22 hours a day, and too much stimulation will get her agitated, so don't do that. It was not unusual advice. So the idea that your child was a cognitively, emotionally, social developing being was somewhat foreign 100 years ago. That's not the advice that middle-class moms were given about what to do with their kids. Fresh air was of use. You can see it's no longer because there isn't any more. But what happens around the middle of the century is that the advice really shifts from being about the physical well-being of your child to the cognitive and socio-emotional development of your child. We start to think of children as having minds and brains, not just think of them as bodies. And so lots of the advice, and this is partly due to the rise of developmental psychology in the middle part of the century and so on, but a lot of the advice switches to be about thinking about your child as a developing being in terms of her mind, right? And that has continued today. And if you think about who takes up this kind of advice, when there's a new innovation in medical technology, who gets it first? Who becomes aware of it? Who has the resources to do it? Folks with more income and higher education. And so what we see happening starting in the 70s and going is that middle-class families and higher income families sort of get the message that you should think about your child as a cognitive being and you should invest in his or her cognitive development and socio-emotional development, not just make sure that you feed her the right stuff. And because middle-class families adopt that earlier than lower-income families, they sort of get the message that this is important earlier, we start to see this big disparity in the kinds of investments in children happening in the 70s and the 80s that leads to this growing disparity in kindergarten readiness and school performance later on between high and low income students. But so what happens then more recently? Because if we look at this picture, there's this little downturn. So my colleague Jimena Portilla and I did this study a few years ago where we looked at data from that 1998 study I told you about, where they had 25,000 kindergarten students. In 1998. They did another study like it in 2010 with another nationally representative sample of kids in kindergarten in 2010, and we found that the school readiness gap, the test score gap in early literacy skills and numeracy skills and so on, was about 15% smaller in 2010 than that gap had been in 1998. That is this, and that's what drives that decline in the picture there, is that the gap has actually started to narrow over this more recent time period, which is good news, right? So what's changed to make that happen? Did income inequality start to reverse? No. As I showed you, income inequality kept going up. Maybe preschool is, low-income families are getting more access to preschool. If you look at the gap in preschool enrollment between high and low-income families, that gap peaked in the 1980s and has declined somewhat since then, but it hasn't declined much since the mid-1990s. So we don't think that it's the changes in preschool enrollment that seem to be driving this. It's not that low-income families have more access to preschool than they did 15, 20 years ago, and that's driving. There is evidence that the quality of preschool has improved, and it's hard for us to test whether maybe some of this is driven by changes in the quality of preschool. I think that's still a quite plausible explanation, but perhaps not the only one. The other thing that I should say is not only did income inequality increase over this time, in this recent time period, since the late 90s, income inequality is higher, but also the demographics of poor and rich families have changed in ways that would make you think the gap would get even larger. So the disparity in educational attainment between high and low income mothers is bigger now than it was in 1998. The percentage of low-income families who don't speak English at home or who are immigrants and so therefore whose children might not do well on an English language assessment, is the disparity in family background by ethnicity and national origin is bigger now than it was. So you might think those things would lead to bigger disparities in school readiness between high and low-income kids, but we see this narrowing. So what's going on that's leading to these school readiness gaps actually getting smaller? It's not income inequality getting better. It's not demographics changing in ways that would lead to it getting better. It's probably not, at least entirely, due to preschool. One thing that has changed is children's health insurance. So CHIP has been in the news of late. So this is a great picture. It just came out recently on this. I found it on this website, econofact.org. But what it shows is the health insurance coverage rates by family income from the late 80s all the way to the present day. And you can see that insurance coverage for middle and high income families hasn't changed much over the time. It's been near universal over that whole time period. But what has changed is the insurance coverage rates for low income families, and particularly for the kind of near poor, that is those sort of at the poverty line or just above, what CHIP was intended to target. So both the Medicaid expansions and CHIP, which comes in 1997 and sort of rolls out among states in different ways and different times, really closes that insurance gap so that by 2017, children's health insurance is pretty near universal across the income distribution. And so it may be that part of what benefits children's school readiness from the late 90s to the 2010 period was the improvements in health insurance coverage for low-income families over that time point. So that's sort of one clear social policy thing that looks like it's changed dramatically and would, for lots of reasons, lead to better school readiness for low-income students. The other thing we found that's changed, and this is work that I did with Jane Waldfogel and Daphne Bassock and Jenna Finch, is we looked at what parents say they do with their kids in the 1998 study and the 2010 study. And what we found was, I think, quite fascinating. So if you look at, they ask parents things like, how often do you visit a library? How often do you take your children to the zoo? How often do you visit a museum? The kinds of things that you might think of as kind of cognitively stimulating, developmentally stimulating activities that high-income families tend to do a lot more than low-income families because they have the time and the money largely to do that. The yellow lines here are the patterns in 1998. The horizontal axis is income and the vertical axis is the rate at which they do this. And so you can see in 1998, low-income families were much less likely to visit a library than high-income families. But by 2010, the library going rates didn't change much for high-income families, but went up substantially for low-income families. Same with visiting a zoo, same to some extent with visiting a museum. We see some of this when we look at how often do you read to your children and so on. And we look at some things about computer usage as well. So how often do children use a computer for learning? So the question is, how often does your child use a computer for math or reading games, or games to help them learn math or reading? So not just sort of surfing the web, kind of using the computer, but kind of things designed to learn. And you can see that that didn't change much for high-income families, but it went up a lot for low-income families. So measures like this suggest that part of what's changed from 1998 to 2010 is that low-income families have started to do more of the kind of developmentally appropriate, cognitively stimulating activities that high-income families have been doing for decades. Whereas high-income families, they've been doing these for a while and aren't doing them particularly more than they used to. And it's some of that narrowing of the gap in parenting activities, early childhood experiences, that seems to contribute to it. When we do some fancier regression modeling and so on, it looks like these changes in home experiences account for maybe half of the narrowing of that gap from 1998 to 2010. And so one way to think about this is think about parents' kind of investment in the cognitive development of their children as a kind of a new technology that comes along, people start to get aware of starting the middle of the century. And like many innovative technologies, those with the most resources benefit from it first. They have the resources to act on it, they have the time, they have the money to invest, they have the social networks that make them more aware of its value and so on. And so that initially creates wider inequality. And that's what we saw sort of from the 70s through 2000. But as an innovation becomes more widely diffused, then it can start to become equalizing under the right circumstances, because then it becomes available to everyone. And so I think of this kind of, not specific activities, but the idea that your child is a developing being who needs you to nurture them. That idea becomes sort of transformative in the domain of inequality, and initially created more inequality, but now looks like it may be starting to reduce inequality. So Annette Lareau, the sociologist, did this study some years ago where she followed around working class families and middle class families with young kids in the annoying way that, you know, ethnographers do, I guess, and tried to understand the child rearing practices of middle and low and working class families. And the way she describes it is that they had different ideas about what you were supposed to do as a parent. And the middle class parents thought of their children as orchids. That is, you sort of hover over them and you nurture them, and you get out the eyedropper and you give them a little water now and then, and you check on them, and you know, they need attention. And the working class parents thought of their children as trees. Trees grow. That is what they do. You don't go out and water your trees and sort of check on them every day and make sure they're sprouting branches in the right places. They just grow. And so they had a sort of theory, a kind of theory of natural growth, that children just grow and that's what they do, whereas the middle class families had a theory of nurtured growth, you know. And I think that theory of nurtured growth, and when Annette did her study, it was late 1980s, I think that theory of nurtured growth has diffused more broadly into society. Not just through things like home visiting, but programs like Reach Out and Read, 30 million words, Too Small to Fail. The sort of mass marketing of the idea of your child as a developing being has great power. And I think, though I can't prove it, I think it's the diffusion of that idea through the work that folks like you do and lots of other kinds of things, where we've kind of gotten the message out in ways that are accessible to people of a broader range of economic backgrounds. And that's, I think, makes me optimistic that there are ways we can reduce some of the inequality in society. I would be remiss, though, not to point out that there's no way we're going to eliminate inequality of economic opportunity simply through encouraging families with few resources to do more with their limited resources. That is, there's a big structural problem, and to imagine that it's all just about choices you make with limited resources does, I think, a disservice to families and to our society as a whole. And so even though I think that's important work to do, I think it's insufficient on its own. We need to sort of also think about how do we create a much more equal opportunity structure where there's not so much economic inequality, where the differences in resources aren't so great, where the economic segregation isn't so great, so that there's a good preschool and childcare center in every neighborhood, and good social networks, and jobs, and maternity leave and paternity leave, and all the things that make it possible for parents to do more of what we know is important for them to do. So with that partly optimistic note, I will thank you for all the work you do for families and children, and I'll take your questions. Or not.
If you have questions, just step up to one of the mics. They're right in the middle of the room. And
thank you, Dr. Reardon. That was terrific. I'm curious to know where you see your research going next.
Great question. So one of the things I'm really frustrated by is we have this, we have a lot of data. We have 300 million test scores, so it's a lot. But, it's limited in that it's only from 3rd to 8th grade. And what we'd really like to know is what can we learn about communities that seems to help us understand what drives some of these differences in early opportunity, what drives some of the differences in the growth opportunity kids have. So we've been trying to collect information, say, on the type and availability and quality of preschool programs in every community in the United States. We'd love to have data on kindergarten readiness everywhere, that we could start to see how much of it is K through 3 stuff and how much of it is pre-K stuff. We'd love to think about how to link it to health data and figure out where some of this is driven by health. So what we have is sort of maps of opportunity. And we're trying to think about how do we now figure out what's the drivers of those differences in opportunities to understand where some actionable points for change. So I think of this as sort of social epidemiology, in the sense that we're trying to map out the patterns, but the next step is then you think about how do you diagnose, and then how do you figure out where to intervene, where are the high leverage points.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. I'm over here.
Oh, hi.
And I'm just wondering, this exact slide, if you happen to know, and if you don't, maybe a suggestion of how to put this in a global context. How different this looks in other developed parts of the world or in what's called the majority world, in your estimation?
Yeah, so I did a study with Kate Chmielewski, who's a professor at University of Toronto, and we used some data to measure the size of the achievement gap between high and low income students in about 20 OECD, developed OECD countries. And the US ranks near the top or bottom, that is, has among the largest of those gaps. And then Caton's been doing some other work recently trying to look at the trends in other countries. Are the gaps growing in other countries? Are they narrowing in other countries? And I think the story there is mixed. Some places these gaps have been narrowing over time, and some they've been widening over time. But in terms of just magnitude, the US is pretty large on this dimension relative to most other developed countries.
Hello, thank you. That was fascinating. So actually I have two questions, one of which I think you addressed in the first point, but this is a home visiting conference, so what we all want to know is what variation does home visiting account for? And so I guess the question is, are there any large data sources that you know about service delivery that could be mapped onto these kinds of data to give us some sense of what impact the kinds of services we all do is having? And then the second question I have is, I wonder if you've looked at variation within poor families. Obviously, we're not going to solve poverty anytime soon, especially not in the next 3 years. And so, the question is, not all poor families are doing equally well or equally poor, or equally not well. And so I wonder what the variation looks like within poor families and if you've looked at that.
Yeah, so on the first question, I don't know of data, but you guys might. That is what we'd love to be able to do, is to sort of figure out in what places is there, say, high penetration, high use of home visiting programs or other kinds of services, and does that map onto the patterns of outcomes we see early in kids' lives? Can we use that to kind of identify that? Some people have done our data is all publicly available, by the way, so all of that data is up on our website. I should have made a slide with the website, but so you can download it. It's all identified by district name. You can link it to any other data you have about communities or counties or whatever. So if you have data and want to do research with it, have at it. That's what it's there for. There's a grants competition that Russell Sage and William T. Grant Foundation are running right now for researchers who want to use the data. You can apply for small grants from them to use the data. You can use the data without the grants. It's available, but nice to have money. So that's all an advertisement to use the data. But we haven't used it to link it to service data, but we would love to. And I don't know those kinds of data sets very well, and so if you know of them or want to work on it or have ideas, we'd always be happy to sort of talk about ways we can do that. My team has a lot on its plate, but we have a big appetite too. So on the second question, we can't distinguish much, unfortunately, by any characteristics of poor families, because all we have is whether the families or the students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, and we can't distinguish much more finely than that among students. Some state data systems have a little bit better data, but most education data systems don't have great data on characteristics of family. And so that's a limitation, I think, of the data systems. States that have integrated data systems where they link education data to other kinds of service data and health data and birth certificates and that are probably the best place to do some of that kind of work. But we have not done that yet.
On your slide where you showed the number of kids who use computers 3 times a week and the kids who are using computers for learning, the third chart showed the huge gap between the number of kids in poverty that have access to the internet and the number in wealth that have access to the internet, not coming close to intersecting in any way. And what concerns me when I look at our population of low-income children and their parents is the ability to know how to use internet technology to innovate, to answer.
I can hear you.
Okay. And that whole way of actually using that new technology, is there any, I mean, to me, that seems like that is going to just continue to widen the education gap. Are you guys looking at that, the internet access and how to use that technology?
We're not, but so one thing about this is the specific question they were asked here is, how much does your child use the computer for the internet? Which is different than, do you use the computer for the internet, or do you have broadband internet access? So these certainly understate the amount of access, simply because, and it's not clear it's actually a good thing for 5-year-olds to be using the internet. So I don't quite know how to interpret that. But your broader point is real disparities in access to broadband internet and use of it for those kinds of things. We haven't done much on that. I saw a recent report by, I'm forgetting who. I'll try to think of it and let you know. But there are some organizations who've been studying this. And the disparities in broadband access, I think, are narrower than they used to be, but still there. And in the absence of kind of public policy to think of broadband internet as a public utility, I think that's going to remain a problem.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if some comparative research was done on the standardized testing itself, because I know that in the past, in history, it has shown that some tests can be culturally biased and compared to, where these kids are at that level, and also the things they see, on TV, where they fit actually into society itself.
What was the second question?
Where they fit in society, or the things that are they see on TV, commercials, and different things that they're not included in some of those things.
Yeah, so one of the limitations of using standardized tests is that they're standardized tests, and they're limited in a number of ways, not least of which is they have the potential to be biased in some ways. They also have the potential, because they're high stakes in the US education system, to be distorted through cheating or various other things that are cheating by a different name, I guess. So we can't sort of solve that problem. We do a bunch of validation checks to see if the tests are really comparable across states and grades, and whether or not there seems to be big distortions due to their high stakes nature of it. And there are in individual places they're not perfect, but in all the broad patterns are true. Now the question of whether there's cultural bias in tests, yes and no. So most of modern tests undergo a process called differential item functioning tests, where they look to see whether two students of different gender or different race scored differently on a given item, even though they scored the same on average on all the other items. So if you and I had equal scores on most of the tests, but systematically girls got one item wrong when boys got that item right, they would take that off because it suggests it's gender biased or racially or ethnically biased. So that protects you against items that are sort of individually biased, and most of these tests do a pretty good job of avoiding that. But what they don't do a good job of avoiding is things like stereotype threat or systematic bias of the whole test, because of course if you're comparing people who did equally well on the rest of the test, you're sort of assuming the rest of the test is kind of equally fair. So most studies of stereotype threat or other kinds of bias of tests suggest there is some bias, and that's exacerbated in certain situations. And so when looking at trends over time, that's probably less of a worry, because that doesn't change much over time. So we might worry that the magnitude of the gaps is off because of systematic stereotype threat or other kinds of bias on the test. But it's unlikely that the amount of that bias has changed dramatically over time. So the trends still tell us probably something real, even if we worry a little bit about the levels. So while I don't think these are immune, the tests we're using aren't immune from those problems, the general patterns they tell us, I think, are still quite indicative. And I always like to remind people to think about these again as measures of opportunity, not measures of intelligence or motivation or capacity in any way. That is, there aren't any systematic differences in the innate capacity across population groups or across geographic regions. So all of these differences have to arise from socially constructed things, and those are differences in opportunity or differences in responses to tests that come from identity, my identity in relationship to the test, which also can be thought of as a difference in opportunity. So, while we worry about all of those things, I think they don't take away from the sort of big points here about differences in opportunities across place and across time.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you can take some of the ideas that you presented us today, and I know your own body of research and your knowledge of the rich, extant research in this area, and tell us how we might take action based on any of these things. Are there ways that we could do certain things based on this data or based on your knowledge? Are there bright spots, for instance, that might be able to help us to implement ideas that would have a positive impact?
I wish, but I mean, in the sense that, one of the frustrating things about this kind of work is that it is sort of epidemiological in character. That is, it's broadly descriptive. It tells us something about the magnitude of the problems and where they're located and at what point in kids' development and that. But it doesn't necessarily tell us about what the most effective strategies are. And I think for that, you need to turn to some of the experimental and intervention work. And so home visiting is one area that's actually, I think, led the way in this in terms of being grounded in a rich body of rigorous experimental evidence that's both demonstrated effectiveness and also tried to understand what are the conditions under which this strategy is more or less effective, and for whom, and why, and how do you do it. And so I think the pushing for continuing to develop that evidence base, that is not just saying we did some studies and we know it's effective, but continuing to push for, let's learn how to make it more effective and make it more effective for a broader set of the population and figure out the conditions under which certain features of it work better or not. The field of education as a whole needs more of that and isn't in some ways as far along in many dimensions as home visiting is, which has a longer, deeper history of this. But my understanding is there's still lots more work to be done in terms of figuring out what are the kind of most salient features and most effective ways to design these programs, as there are with childcare, with preschool and education and other things. So one is I think to continue to push for the development of that rigorous evidence base that teaches us what to do, and that helps make the case for increased funding and increased implementation if you can show that the more you know about how to make programs more effective, the better. So one thing I would say is a continued support for and push for kind of developing the rigorous evidence base on which home visiting is already nicely founded and could grow more. And the other thing is, I think, I'm a big fan of the power of data. And so one of the frustrating things is when we do things and we try out social programs or policies, but we don't sort of collect the data or maintain the data in a way that lets us later on figure out their long-term impact or figure out what was really effective. And so the more that home visiting and other kinds of social programs can get their data kind of incorporated into state data systems that make it possible then to sort of see what are the longer-term impacts on kids' development, not just in the short and medium term, but can we sort of see that long term? I think that will go a long way towards making the case for the importance of this kind of work. So I am, usually the guy who tells you what's wrong with the world and not how to fix it. So, but today at least I tell you a little something, this is what's going right in the world, but still, I'm not the guy who usually knows the answer to how to fix it. So that's all I can offer you. Oh, over here, yeah. It depends a lot on where they fall on those scatter plots. Rahm Emanuel invited me out for drinks. He's very happy about Chicago. So the range is, I find a lot of folks really interested, the ones who engage me, are actually really interested in learning what's going right and what's going wrong. So Evanston, Illinois, I didn't show you this, but when we look at racial achievement gaps in these data, so Evanston, Illinois has one of the largest black-white test score gaps of any school district in the country. It's a pretty affluent and moderately diverse community with enormous racial disparities. And they invited me to Evanston, and I gave a talk, and I met with community leaders, and I met with the superintendent. And they followed up with a whole bunch of questions and wanted to know, can you show us 15 districts around the country who are demographically like us, but have better outcomes than us, so I can send my team there to go talk to people and figure out are there strategies we can implement. So that, to my mind, is a great response. It's a sort of an engagement with the problem and trying to figure out, can we use the data and use our resources to figure out how to improve it. So I get a lot of that. I mean, I suspect the people who are disgruntled don't email me or call me. So I think I get a biased perception. I get the positive engagement, but not the annoyed people.
Hi. So just sort of following up on that, have you further disaggregated the data by race? Just because since we know, for things like infant mortality, black women with college and graduate degrees still have poorer birth outcomes than white women with high school degrees. So I was just wondering sort of how race plays into all of this.
Yeah. In the interest of time, I didn't show you any of the race ethnic breakdowns, but the website has all the data for every district broken down by race and ethnicity as well as overall. So I don't know how to summarize it in a sentence or two, but yes, it's all there, and we have a few papers about the racial disparities and where they're larger and where they're smaller. But beyond that, I don't know I'm not going to summarize it in a sentence, probably. Yeah. One more. Last question.
Hi, my team and I work with tribes, and so we're just wondering how we can get tribal representation on the graph as well.
Tribal representation. So we have excluded the data from BIE schools for now because we've been having trouble figuring out how to make their test scores comparable to the other ones. So the raw data that we get from the US Department of Education has data from all BIE schools, but we haven't included it in what we've put on the web because of this comparability issue. We're still trying to figure out what we can do with it. If you're interested in using the data from the BIE schools, let me know, and we'll see if we can figure out if there's something we can give you that would be useful, depending what we use. It's tricky to put it on this same comparable scale with everything else because of differences in who takes the tests and how they're equatable. Yeah. All right, thank you all very much.